back to this afternoon session of Inspiring Trust. It's a six-part webinar series. This is a special fourth edition on vulnerability in institutions. And in this second half here, we're going to be speaking with Ruth Kelly from the United Kingdom. Just wanted to give you just a couple of reminders, is that if you are looking for interpretation, if you're looking for either English or Spanish, you can click at the bottom of your screen, the little icon that says interpretation, and it brings up the options for either English or Spanish. And then also that if you'd like to send in your questions, the second half of this next 40 minutes will be dedicated to some questions and answers, and we'll finish up right at the top of the hour. And so please, and thank you to Gemma and to Bernadette for filtering through those questions. So we'll move on to this interview now. This is a practical application here. I'll be interviewing Ruth about financial management and transparency. Ruth joins us from Great Britain. She's a member of the Vatican's Council for the Economy, and she served the Labour government there in Great Britain between 2004 and 2008 as Secretary of State for Education. She also has served in many other roles. And she then joined the HSBC Global Asset Management as Global Head of Client Strategy. More recently, she was working for St. Mary's in Twickenham University College. Ruth, you have this vast experience. I just want to say welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Alan, and it's really good to be here.
So Ruth, it's such a rare pleasure. I work here near the Vatican and we cover all Vatican news. It's such a rarity to be able to sit down and speak so openly. We have 264 participants in this session who are hearing you speak on what goes on in the Council for the Economy and your perspective on principled leadership and strategy regarding institutions. I want to ask you just to set a little bit of context for people who may not know so much about how the Vatican finances work. What does the Council for the Economy do, and what is your role within it?
Yes, I mean, it's a good place to start because we're still finding our feet. It's a fairly new council. It was put together last September. So virtually every meeting so far has been virtual. Some people attended the very first one between lockdowns, but many of the members haven't even met in person yet. But I find there's a really strong willingness and spirit, both among the lay members, of which I'm one, and among the cardinals, to make an impact and to make an impact quickly in terms of financial transparency and the management of the Holy See's finances. So the council is composed of 7 lay members and 8 cardinals, so there's a majority of cardinals. Nevertheless, there's a real recognition that it's now very important at the heart of the church to have lay experts involved in overseeing the Vatican accounts and policies and so forth. And that is important not just in its own sake, but also for the credibility of the process. One of the formal responsibilities of the council is to set the budget for the Holy See entities. So that's a task that happens every year. Beyond that, actually the council can set its own scope to a large extent. And this is very, very interesting. So when I attended the first meeting in person in Rome in September, the detailed overview that the council members were exercising over the Holy See accounts only actually covered about 1/3 of the Holy See's funds. Others were still outside that process. Already within 6 months or so, that covers 2/3 of the funds in the Holy See's management. And the ambition is to keep on adding entities. So there's a really full overview of what's going on inside the Holy See. And to challenge, to set the budget, but also to challenge and to make sure that financial management is working at the highest standards possible.
We're speaking particularly about sound financial management and about transparency. What is this group doing to promote in your initial meetings that sort of a culture?
Well, it's done some very important things already. One is to make sure that the agenda of each meeting. So the topics of discussion is published and a summary published immediately after the meeting so that people can see what's under consideration. That already is a huge step forward. The other is to bring far more of the Holy See's funding under its remit so that it can be scrutinized in detail, audited in detail and consolidated in the publication of the Vatican accounts. We're also working very hard to make sure that international accounting standards, or the equivalent for the Holy See, are implemented in every part of the budget that we oversee. So as I said, it's a work in progress, but there are really quite important changes already happening.
You worked for the British government, you've worked for private banking. You are in a situation to have a real sort of broad perspective on what should and shouldn't be done. If we look at the Vatican and its financial practices, what makes it a different beast from the other places that you've worked at?
Well, there are lots of differences, clearly. I mean, it's a completely mission-driven organization. For obvious reasons, there are clerics at the heart of major decisions in the Holy See, many of whom have not been involved, in fact, the majority of whom have not been involved in equivalent organizations before starting to run major sums of money and be responsible for a very substantial international entity. So there's both a difference in terms of the experience of the people involved and the expectations, I suppose, which arguably are even higher than you might expect in a secular organization. So there is a mismatch between levels of awareness, experience, and what's expected by the public and by wider society.
There's been this long-standing reform process that's been going on. A lot of that has to do also with how money is managed within the Vatican. What do you find are the standards that exist within the Vatican for money management similar to another government, or similar to those in private banking, or have you found a sort of disparity there in your experience?
Yes, so the ambition is the same. The ambition is to have international accounting standards applied in full across the Holy See. That's not a position in which we have arrived at yet, but it is one to which we aspire. And in that respect, the ambitions are similar to any other large secular organization. The differences are, I guess, that the Vatican has to move very, very quickly now. It's trying to catch up on progress over the last 20 or 30 years in the outside world, as it were. So, for example, the historic legacy is very, very difficult to tackle. If you take the example of, say, a priest or a bishop that has a house through tradition or a place of residence through tradition in a particular part of the Vatican or Rome or somewhere in the world, it may be the case that no one has ever had it valued or really thought about who legally owned it, because through custom and tradition it was obvious to what use it should be put. So as a specific example, the Holy See cannot yet account for all of the investment properties that it owns, specifically around Rome and in Italy. And there's a huge task to go through to make sure it identifies properly the ownership of each, whether it's owned by a diocese, whether it's owned by the Vatican, whether it's owned by a parish or somebody else, and then to value it and to make sure those are properly accounted for in the balance sheets. So that's one real area where the Holy See needs to be brought quickly up to date.
Is it fair to say, Ruth, that this process, there were many other people that came before you that also worked with the Council for the Economy, that worked in different financial administrations within the Vatican. Is it fair to say that they all approached the Vatican's finances in a similar way? What will make you successful, potentially, where those who preceded you perhaps have not been fully successful?
We're actually only the sort of the second phase of the Council for the Economy. There was one council before us on which, again, there was a mixture of lay and clerical representation. And that was set up by the current Pope in 2014. So the council didn't exist before that. The Pope, in his wisdom, decided to change the membership almost entirely last year. I think that's just because there was a greater awareness of what needed to be done, and the fact that people with different expertise could bring in new ideas and help the secretariats in the Holy See respond to those challenges. In particular, the Pope decided to appoint 6 women out of the 7 lay members, and I think partly to make a statement about the role of women in the church, but also to get her to move away from perhaps a slight clericalism that had been, as we know, the Pope is very keen to bring lay expertise in. It's sometimes easier for women to break through in those situations than it is for men.
You mentioned that this is a process that needs to happen very quickly. The Vatican is famous for not doing anything that quickly. It's looking for long processes. How do you expect this process to happen quickly? Are you putting measures in place as a council?
It is happening quickly. It really is. I'm actually very encouraged by the steps that I've seen, even though there's so much to do and so far to go. So investment properties, as I've mentioned, are all being valued, and there's a huge amount of work going on that. We're currently in the council looking at implementing a Holy See-wide investment policy that would show how, that would set out clearly how Vatican investments should be, or Holy See investments should be managed. The Pope has made very decisive action on bringing more into the scope, under the scope of the Council of the Economy, as I've mentioned before. International standards are being implemented broadly. There's a huge training program taking place across the different dicasteries so that people can understand what's expected from them. For example, in procurement policies, a classic area where things can go wrong if they're not properly applied. So I do expect results, very significant results, before the 6 years run out at the end of the council's current term.
What do you expect will be the obstacles to potentially reaching that success?
I think the obstacles tend to be lack of awareness and lack of understanding of the importance of these sorts of policies, rather than anything more fundamental than that. So the training agenda is very, very important. And it's just not surprising that there are tensions between what individuals seek to do, sometimes for extremely good reasons, through charity, for example, and what the standards of good corporate governance are that are accepted worldwide for international institutions. For example, if somebody who works in the Holy See or in the church more broadly sees a young person who desperately needs a job and offers them a job without going through a formal interview process, I mean, morally, that might be absolutely the right thing to do in that specific situation. But actually, if that's the way appointments happen, reputation can be undermined more broadly. So it's really increasing awareness of the appropriateness of following international standards and helping people to understand why they're there and why it's important to follow them.
We've got a group of communicators with us, right? People that specialize in communications for hospitals, universities, for dioceses in the world. If we look at the way that Vatican finances are spoken about, even very recently in world media, secular and Catholic, it's often very negative. Do you feel that the framing of the narrative is fair to the Vatican as you found it? And how do you think that the Vatican should reframe the narrative for the future?
Yeah, I mean, to be sort of blunt, to be brutally honest about it, from my perspective, or the council's perspectives, or indeed people external to the Holy See's perspective, it's not clear how funds have been flowing and how they've been managed, because the transparency hasn't been there. That doesn't necessarily suggest there's anything that's been done wrong, but it's impossible to scrutinise a system properly if you haven't got the appropriate transparency. So making sure there is that scrutiny and transparency in place, as a backbone of the whole system, is really fundamentally important, because any narrative can take hold if that transparency isn't there, and we just won't know how to rebut it. So once that transparency is there and international standards are applied, then you can start talking altogether differently about the Vatican's role and its responsibility and how it manages money and so forth. Take the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank is a classic example. I mean, it's been embroiled in all sorts of scandals over the years. The Vatican Bank has, as it were, been at the forefront of change. I mean, it's now commonly recognised to work to the highest international standards from a transparency point of view. It's externally audited, it has accounts that are unqualified, it regularly faces international inspections and so forth, and passes with flying colours. So there is no reason why that sort of a transformation shouldn't be taking place across the entire Holy See.
In your perspective, is the Vatican doing everything it can to reach full transparency as quickly as it can?
Well, as you say, the Vatican's not known for moving fast. The observation I'd have is it's very under-resourced, and there are people working extremely hard to make change, but they're up against it because, historically, these functions have not been well resourced in the Holy See. What's
at stake here? What if you fail?
Yeah, I think the reputation of the church, actually. I think the reputation of the church has already suffered through financial scandals and reporting, and that is already being felt among Catholics, both perhaps in their church going, also there are clearly broader issues for that reason, but also in their willingness to donate to support the Holy See, which is a sort of very tangible and direct link through to the Holy See. If someone's going to, put money into the Peter's Pence account, they need to know that that money is being well spent. And at the moment, you can't say definitely that we can show that, but we're well on the way, I think, to be able to do that before too long.
How long?
Well, as I say, before the end of our term, but I hope much sooner than that.
And how, just before we go to questions, and I invite anybody who would like to pose a question to Ruth Kelly to go ahead and write it. I wanted to know just how the pandemic has affected very concretely, because we can imagine that it's, the tens of millions that haven't come in just into the Vatican museums because of a lack of pilgrims and tourists. If you look from your perspective, looking at sort of the whole picture, how dramatic is the situation in the Vatican because of the pandemic?
Yes, the Holy See suffered along with every other organisation or many other organisations in the pandemic, and that's not surprising. The question really for the council is how much of that is temporary and how much of that will bounce back. Clearly, the Vatican or the Holy See or the Council is extremely focused at the moment on cost restraint, and the budget reflected that for this year. And different departments have been asked to come up with reductions in their spending. I mean, that's very, very tough for mission-based organisations who are effectively cost centres. They're not there to raise money. They're not there to make money. They're there to spend it wisely. So they have been asked to come up with savings, and the Pope himself has also issued a motu proprio which has cut clerical salaries and the salaries of those working in the Holy See, which is clearly not desirable, but is necessary at this time. However, departments are rising to the challenge. They are finding the savings, and this is something that in the longer term should be able to be put right.
Yes, did the council recommend the cutting of the salaries in the Vatican?
Recommended specifically particular cost constraints,
Including that one.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into the detail of what was recommended or not, but clearly looking at the salary structure is a sort of inevitable part of looking about how to restrain costs.
Thank you. So we've got a first question here from Adriano Lomello in Argentina. He says, thank you for speaking about the Vatican finances and it's a little bit about its history. He says, what's the budget that the Holy See allocates to its entire communication strategy? If you could share that.
I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. So we don't get to that level of detail. That would be a budget line which would then need to be consolidated across all the different entities. And I've never seen it presented in that form, I'm afraid to say. We're much higher level than that, which is, do we have enough money coming in to fund the outgoings? And what are the sort of standards that are being applied? So for each different department in the Holy See, they'd be asked to come up with whatever it is, a 5% cut in their budget. But we wouldn't say, and that has to come from the communications budget, or that would be devolved for local decision making.
Are you tasked also with the sort of fundraising process? Is that something that you would advise on, asking more money for specific projects from specific areas of the church?
No, that's not something that we would get involved with, although clearly we see the consequences of the fundraising strategy. And it is the case that fundraising has been severely dented through the COVID crisis, not surprisingly, as it has been felt right throughout the church. Mm-hmm. So, it is one of the areas in our minds as we think about how to restore the reputation and how to create a strong reputation for how the Holy See manages finances.
Has the budget for the Council for the Economy been slashed as well?
It's been done. We don't. I'm afraid to say, get paid. So there's no budget to cut for the members of the council.
That's great. Thank you, and thank you for your work. So Maria in California is asking, what investigations have been conducted to specifically look into any connection between financial mismanagement and sexual misconduct in the Vatican?
Well, it's not something that we've covered as a council. As I said, we are much more concerned about getting the structures in place rather than about trying to dig up, as it were, and go through the trails of historic issues that have emerged in the past. However, having said that, if an issue emerges, we would now expect that to be reported to the Council of the Economy and for us to understand how it managed to happen. So this is changing. But right for now, we are very much focused on getting those basic standards in place and making sure the information that's in front of the Pope when he makes decisions is full, complete, and fair. And we're not in that situation yet.
There have been situations, Ruth, where, say, the management of money from the Secretariat of State has been sent to another department now. We have the creation of the AIF, the Financial Intelligence Authority, that is not that old, but that oversees certain things. There was an overhaul in there just a couple of years ago. All of these sort of point to a certain vulnerability and a certain volatility in these what should be established sort of departments and institutions. Do you feel like things are set up in a way today where no more changes need to be made on that sort of institutional level, or is that all in process as well?
No, changes do need to be made, and specifically on the Secretary of State, the funds under their control, that's all been taken out of the Secretary of State's control. That was one of the changes that was made and given to APSA, which manages a huge chunk of the remaining funds. So APSA is under the direct oversight, of the council. So all of those funds will now be monitored in detail by the council, whereas that wasn't the case in the past.
And was that by direct request of the council?
The council has said that its scope needs to increase to bit by bit cover the rest of the Holy See, but that was a direct decree from the Holy Father.
Do you feel like the Holy Father listens to the suggestions that you make?
We are very lucky that the chair of the council, Cardinal Marx, and the secretary prefect of the council, Monsignor Brian Firm, regularly report to the Holy Father on the affairs of the council. They go and speak about them after every meeting. So no doubt that informs his opinion.
Very good, thank you. So a question from Jose Maria Navalpotro Sanchez Peinado from Madrid says, you're betting on transparency, but how is it possible to establish trust? Aren't those who work there afraid of possible reprisals from those who did things differently? The former Secretary of the Economy, Cardinal Pell, had to step aside for other reasons. Changes in the IOR management asks the question. The case of Cardinal Beccio himself, these cases suggest old ways of doing things could still come back to haunt.
Well, one of the things that's on my mind to really explore as we go forward is how the whole whistleblowing setup works in the Vatican, because I think part of an open culture is not only financial transparency, but the ability of people to raise issues in private, perhaps without being identified, or only identified if they so wish. Now, I do know that whistleblowing happens, but I'm not yet sure that that works well enough within the Holy See and the Vatican. So it's a very, very good question. I certainly wouldn't claim that, you know, the whole culture is open. We're not there. You know, there's a huge way to go. But I do think that the will is there at the very top to see change happen.
A question from Daniel Arasa, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Communications of Santa Croce University, says there's a lack of education in management and finances among church people. What's the best solution? Train priests for management, or move priests aside and put lay managers in their place?
It's a very, very interesting question. There are some priests who would naturally take to management. Maybe there are some who've been managers before becoming priests, and who bring great skills. And there are others who, with training and education, should, you know, could grow into that and develop very well. And of course, we should encourage that. Probably every priest needs some education and training in financial management and what's expected, because I do think the whole of the clergy needs to, you know, to have a certain basic level of understanding, or there will be problems in the future. Having said all of that, probably, in my view, there's a much bigger role for lay people in the future. You know, we've seen it work extremely effectively on the Council for the Economy. I know that the feedback from the clerics about lay involvement has been very good, and, you know, that issues are being raised that wouldn't naturally have been thought of before. And I am sure that there's a wide range of roles that are currently filled by clerics that could be done by lay people, and perhaps that would be the better option.
Do you feel that in this process there is more of an Anglo-Saxon way of working than perhaps, you know, it was more of an Italian way in the past? Or what do you think the model that's being followed by the Vatican is leaning towards now?
International standards. I mean, you can describe Italian ways and you can come to your own conclusions about how well Italian ways fit with international standards. But there is an international way of doing things, good back practice corporate governance. You might say it's Anglo-Saxon, but it is adopted by all international institutions that want to be listed on the major stock exchanges, for example. It's very clear what annual reports should look like. They have to be fair, they have to be balanced, and they have to be understandable. And that means by an interested layperson, you know, not full of jargon. You can get to the core of an issue if you want to, as a layperson. And it's that sort of holistic financial information and narrative that we need to be able to produce.
I've got an angry seagull outside my window here. So I've got a question from India, from Father Jashan Rodriguez. It says, obviously transparency doesn't mean that every bit of information is put out in the public domain. With regards to local churches and dioceses, what steps would you recommend in helping the church communicate a culture of financial transparency to its lay faithful?
Well, I do the same, actually. I don't really agree with the question. Obviously, not every single bit of financial information needs to be published, because that would make it impossible to understand as a member of the public when you're looking at it. Too much financial information is worse, is almost as bad as having none at all. It needs to be put together in a way that's helpful for the reader. But for the last 10 years, I've sat on the Archdiocese of Westminster here in London, and it produces a really strong annual report and accounts. It's you know, a lot of time and thought is to put into how best to present the narrative around those, so that people really understand what's going on. And it does show what's happening with donations, how those are being used, and so forth. So I do think that that's certainly something that dioceses should aspire to, and that actually every church organisation at every level should have some basic financial transparency.
What if, Ruth, what if you're in a diocese or a hospital, a university, or any other institution where speaking specifically about the environment of the Catholic Church, and you know, because we're you know, associated here with Santa Croce University in particular, and a lot of us are Catholic communicators. What if you're in a diocese and you're sitting on a problem? You know that you've got a scandal. You don't know what to do with it. Say there was some mismanagement. Say it's by your bishop. What is your recommendation to someone in that situation? What's the way out?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a tough one, but covering it up is the last thing I would suggest. For the reputation of the church, you have to be transparent. It has to be investigated. The auditors have to be called in, and the appropriate action needs to be taken. And if there's corruption, that needs to be investigated. Now, if it's just bad practice rather than corruption, I mean, it might be solved through education, and there might be other ways of solving the issue. But people need, you know, if you are very, very transparent about the problems, you expose them and you say what you're going to do to fix them, actually people can understand that human errors can be made and that mistakes happen, but you can get back on and start supporting that institution again.
Even if it costs your boss his job?
Well, the same principles apply, unfortunately, but they do. And you know, transparency ultimately is essential.
Got a sort of related question there about education from Marc Marie in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It says, what could be the way to organize the formation of priests and religious to be in harmony with a new way of church financial management, this culture of transparency?
Well, I think the university, Santa Croce, has got a very good course in church management. So to plug that.
Cue the commercial.
Which a very good friend of mine, Brian Griffiths in Britain, has been involved in creating. So I do think the Catholic universities have a very significant role to play, and church management, you know, should be part of seminary training as well as sort of other types of learning, and we should have continuous lifelong learning for clergy as well.
One final question. We've got an anonymous question poser who asks, what are the main reasons for problems in Vatican financial management? And I think we'll finish with this one.
Well, I think the main reasons are naivety, in that there is access to money, there are problems to be solved, and there is a lack of understanding and awareness of appropriate procedures that need to be followed. I mean, clearly you can get to a situation in which, you know, I'm sure there have been many instances in the church's history of corruption, but even more fundamental really is just naivety and not understanding proper process and what needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Ruth. This has been very insightful, I hope, for everyone. I hope everyone understands and realizes how much of a privilege this is to be able to ask you such open questions and frank questions on such a well participated in call. So I want to thank you, Ruth, and also Kim and Gabriel and Father Jordi and everybody else who was involved in the organization of this event. It really, for me, I can speak personally, it's been very insightful. And thank you very much to everyone who's involved. If you want to just say a closing word, Ruth, just to say goodbye, and then I'll go to Kim and Gabriel.
just like to say thank you so much for the session. I've really enjoyed it, and good wishes for the entire conference. I've sat in on some of the sessions; they've been absolutely brilliant. So great to be with you today.